Preocupado el presidente anaranjado, viendo que las elecciones las perdió.
Solicita a los que le hacen los mandados que se apuren, pues la fiesta terminó.
Y mirando que se va a acabar el varo,
han formado un titingo. Se han negado a abandonar la Casa Blanca, a la silla del despacho se amarró. Los pelitos que le quedan los arranca, pataleando por la rabia que le dio. Y mirando a Cuba con sus batas blancas, de cabeza se tiró.
El que tenga confusión que se confunda, el que quiera claridad que venga a ver.
La jugada no es compleja ni profunda, está claro cómo quieren proceder.
Solo falta que nosotros los dejemos,
y eso no va a suceder.
Con la conga de los hoyos no te metas.
Cuba viva sin que nadie la someta. Mi tierra linda, mi cubanía, mi bandera se respeta. De La Habana para Santiago, defiende lo tuyo, cubano.
que no te metas con mi tierra, que mi Cuba se respeta.
Soy el mambí que aún vive con el machete en la mano. No, 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 no. ¿Qué me importa si comentas?
De donde vengo yo, estamos listos para la contienda. Aguanta ahí, pero dime tú, ¿pa' qué tú inventas? Con mi pueblo guarachando, yo vine aquí para cantar. Toda Cuba está esperando que yo la ponga a gozar.
Aquí nadie tiene miedo, tú conmigo no te metas. ¡Hey! Oye, soquetón, mi alegría te molesta.
Porque tú me conoces bien en todas mis facetas. Que no tenemos miedo, sal de ahí, no abra esa gaveta.
Everyone, greetings. Thanks so much for being here. This is the Revolution Within the Revolution podcast, presented to y'all by the National Network on Cuba. The National Network on Cuba is a U.S.-based coalition of over 50 social justice organizations in the United States and its colonies, like Puerto Rico, united and taking collective action to end all U.S. attempts to overthrow the Cuban Revolution and harm the Cuban people. My name is Onyesonwu. I'm here with my co-hosts, Ermiya and Jessenia, and we are very, very happy to be with y'all today for the April the 17th, New Moon and Aries edition of our weekly program. We are here every single Friday. Well, we miss one, but most Fridays at 1 p.m. Eastern time to give y'all the latest updates on what's going on in U.S.-Cuba relations and the organization of the U.S.-Cuba Solidarity Movement and beyond. Today on our program, we're going to be talking about the increased escalation of U.S. government rhetoric against the Cuban Revolution. We have anonymous sources in the Trump administration straight up saying that after they finish with Iran, which is not a thing that they're going to do, they lost. and they just can't accept it. But after they finish with Iran, they're going to move on to Cuba in terms of military escalation. And so now is a really, really, really important point as a movement for us to be clear about what's going on and clear about the collective action that we can take together to oppose this and to end the blockade once and for all. Before we move on to the meat of the program, I just want to open it up for my co-hosts to share anything they want to share in the opening. And if not, we just go to the video. Let me know.
Well, hello, everyone. Hello, comrades. My name is Ermiya. I'm one of your co-hosts. I'm an organizer with the Action for Cuba committees. And I'm coming to you today from Washington, D.C., and I'm very excited about today's episode. We're going to be talking about the impacts of the blockade and just how much it oppresses gender-oppressed people on the island. So very excited for today's show.
Yes, as my co-host said, we're very happy to be here, and salam alaikum, everyone. My name is Jessenia Jasmine, and I am also a member of the Action for Cuba committee, and I'm coming to you live from NNOC, also known as Brooklyn, New York. And I'm very excited to be here as well.
Cool. So on this episode, we're going to do a deep dive into the impact of the U.S. blockade on Cuba and on marginalized populations on the island, particularly women, queer and trans folks, and children. And to set some context for the conversation, we're just going to play a video. So without further ado, let me pull it up.
Son precisamente las madres y las mujeres cubanas, en su mayoría frente a hogar, las que también padecen de forma directa lo que causa esta política genocida contra nuestro país.
¡Abajo el bloqueo! ¡Abajo el imperialismo yanqui! ¡Abajo! ¡Viva Cuba!
Nos encontramos aquí en el Parque Mariana Grajales, apoyando a todas las mujeres y condenando el bloqueo a nuestro país.
Realmente desde enero de este año hasta acá se ha seguido recrudeciendo con todo el tema de la prohibición del acceso a Cuba a los combustibles y tiene a la familia cubana en una situación muy compleja.
Es el momento de apoyar cada vez más esta hora de la revolución que está siendo amenazada.
Yo estoy aquí porque soy revolucionaria, porque quiero mi país, porque quiero lo mejor para mi país. Quiero que levanten el bloqueo que nos tienen impuesto injustamente y que nos quiten de las listas de países patrocinadores del terrorismo.
Yo creo que las mujeres, las madres cubanas, las hijas cubanas en sentido general, tenemos el deber moral de sumarnos a esa batalla con mucho más energía, exigiendo que nuestro país se les respete su derecho a recibir combustibles, a seguirse desarrollando, a seguir apostando por la sociedad socialista, con todos y para el bien de todos que nosotros defendemos. Y ahí las mujeres tenemos muchas lecciones de resiliencia, de resistencia, de maneras de hacer en medio de la dificultad. Son precisamente las madres y las mujeres cubanas, en su mayoría frente a hogar, las que también padecen de forma directa lo que causa esta política genocida contra nuestro país. Las que están todos los días pensando qué hacerle para los hijos, las meriendas, las escuelas, la ocupación del hogar, junto por supuesto a toda la familia.
Nos afecta la situación del transporte, nos afecta la situación alimentaria, que aún cuando nosotros inventamos y hacemos cosas, para nadie es un secreto que tenemos situación con la alimentación, sobre todo de las personas adultas.
Niños en los hospitales que necesitan de medicamentos, niños que tienen problemas de cáncer, que no tienen oxígeno, que personas que tienen problemas de hemodiálisis, que tampoco tienen medicamentos, los medicamentos indicados.
Yo soy hija cuidadora de una anciana que está casi postrada, que tiene serias limitaciones de salud, y todo lo que yo hoy utilizo para poder atender dignamente, estoy teniendo muchas dificultades para adquirirlo, porque en las instituciones médicas donde lo recibo no siempre lo hay, con la oportunidad que necesito, y muchas veces sobrevivo por la propia solidaridad de otras compañeras, de otras madres, de otras hijas cuidadoras. Y cuando entras a revisar el fondo del asunto, no está todo en el hospital que atiende a tu mamá, porque el bloqueo no ha permitido que llegue.
Le diría a Trump que es un asesino, que él está haciendo que el mundo entero
esté viviendo momentos muy difíciles.
Yo le digo HP Trump todo el tiempo. Es un genocida, es un asesino, es un ladrón, un pirata, un loco que está destruyendo al planeta.
Que nos respeten, que nos dejen vivir en paz, que nos dejen desarrollarnos.
Le diría que por mucho que intente asfixiarnos de todas las formas posibles, este pueblo sabe no solo resistir, sino que va a salir adelante, que este pueblo es indoblegable, que debería aprender de la historia de Cuba y Estados Unidos, debería aprender de Girón, debería aprender de lo que hemos sido capaces de hacer con prácticamente ningún recurso y con nuestras propias manos.
Nuestra lucha es contra el imperialismo, nuestra lucha es contra el capitalismo, nuestra lucha es contra el bloqueo, porque los presidentes cambian y el bloqueo sigue y el imperialismo sigue, por eso esa vocación antiimperialista siempre la vamos a tener.
Thank you for showing that clip, Onyesonwu, Comrade Onye. And yes, as our Cuban comrade said, resiliency against imperialism is the way that we can secure, our collective liberation. And this is something that is very clear in the consciousness of the revolutionary women in Cuba, right? And calling out and denouncing the genocidal blockade is the way that we can continue, raising awareness and building that consciousness and strengthening it. But it is the clearest form of, actually calling out what this government is doing. And when I say this government, I mean the United States, right? So as like our Cuban comrades in the video said, correctly stated, Trump is a genocidal maniac. He is a monster, and he's following an immoral legacy of continuing imperialism and settler colonialism and attacking nations and their sovereignty, and has consistently targeted the most vulnerable, as we see in Cuba, in Palestine, in Sudan, in Congo, Puerto Rico, in the Philippines, and just globally, right? Wherever imperialism and oppression has crept and remained, right? So to start the discussion, right, and grounding us in the understanding that being a woman is also not a monolith. To fully understand like the blockade's impact, we need to speak about how the Cuban women have been able to organize to mitigate the effects of the blockade, and what can other movements learn from their resilience, but also how does the blockade affect cis women, trans women, and non-binary people. So I guess the question I just asked it to Onye is how have like Cuban women organized to mitigate these effects, and how does the blockade affect cis women, trans women, and non-binary people, and what did you learn during the mini brigade that recently happened this past summer, which was the Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+ brigade, and if you can just share some reflections as to what you learned and saw and were able to speak to comrades about when you were there.
Cool. So I will say that as the Cuban women in the video explained, when imperialist countries engage in economic attacks on places like Cuba, on the third of the Earth's population that is living under US sanctions, the impact of that is felt across the whole of society because they're intentionally targeting civilians, but it's felt more intensely by people that are already marginalized under capitalism, under patriarchy. So if you are a primary caregiver, a mother or a parent, if you are a disabled person, if you are a queer and trans person who already faces systemic oppression under patriarchy, then that is compounded by the economic attack on civilian infrastructure, you are going to feel it worse because you already have access to less resources because of systemic oppression. And so that's like precisely the case in Cuba. And the way that the Cuban people have responded, the way that Cuban people and queer and trans folks have responded is by moving collectively to mitigate this, by moving to organize the Cuban state in such a way that the resources that are limited from the outside because of the blockade are still distributed across the whole society with a focus on the most marginalized. And the way that Cuban women in particular have been able to ensure this is through mass organization, through the Federation of Cuban Women, founded by our revolutionary ancestor, Vilma Espin, in which Cuban women were like, we support the revolution, we are leaders of the revolutionary project, but we also have to organize ourselves as women because we understand most accurately the material conditions that we are struggling against and what needs to happen to transform those conditions. So focusing on the organization of women and marginalized genders and African people and oppressed people in general in Cuba and organizing themselves within the larger project of the revolution is like a really key aspect of how the Cuban Revolution has been able to take care of these sectors that are like doubly, triply oppressed under capitalism, under patriarchy, under imperialism. And when it comes to the Queer and Trans Brigade, I unfortunately did not have the privilege to be there in person. I participated in the other mini brigade that year, actually the MayDay Brigade where we met, and then the African Indigenous Palestinian contingent. But I was not on the Queer Brigade, unfortunately. But I will say that like something that it's like a constant aspect of the program of the Vencenos Brigade, like we have built a relationship with the Cuban people where we have really, really push for people-to-people connections between like queer and trans folks in Cuba and queer and trans folks that we bring on the brigade, as well as like African and colonized folks. And the Cubans have really like met us, and there's been like a lot of valuable exchange. And so something that we've seen historically is again like that queer and trans people understand themselves as part of the Cuban Revolution, occupy positions of leadership within the Cuban Revolution. They understand that the liberation struggle, like their liberation struggle as queer and trans people, as women, as Africans, has to be part of the Cuban Revolution. It's a living project that they're building together. And I think that's something that a lot of times people from the US miss, because for us as queer and trans people in the United States, as African and oppressed people in the United States, our liberation struggle exists in opposition to the US government, because the US government is inherently oppressive. It can't be part of it. Like we can't find liberation through that project, but the context is very, very different in Cuba. So hopefully that answered your question.
No, yeah, it beautifully answered the question, and thank you for clarifying that. And I mean, as you clearly said and very eloquently stated, mass organization comes with prioritizing collectivism, right? And then also making sure that those who are most marginalized, like their voices are heard and like centered and placed on the focal point. And this is something that we continuously see is at the forefront of what is the motivating factor of the Cuban Revolution, the ongoing like socialist project. And it's the clear like distinction from, you know, the system that exists within the empire, because like as you said, like our liberation struggle here within the belly of the beast is in complete opposition to this government's project, and that's not the reality in Cuba, because the Cuban government and the people move together as one, and that collectivism is within their structure and the revolution. So thank you so much for that. And I guess to keep us going with the discussion, this is a question for you, Comrade Ermiya. So the Cuban woman in the video that was shared said and shared that the genocidal blockade, despite the Cuban government's efforts, like hits them first. So what does this tell us about where their power actually lies, and how might lifting this blockade shift that power and bring about change within the society?
Absolutely. Well, I think firstly, I want to mention Comrade Onya had mentioned Comrade Vilma Espin, and she is actually the logo of our show, for those who didn't catch. And it's because I think, you know, Vilma's work and the work of the masses of Cuban women have inspired so many women, not just across Cuba, but across the world, right, to engage in struggle. And I think something that was so important about the video that we had just watched was that the women who were coming out into the streets, they were not saying, oh, we're just here to be neutral and to condemn violence and to, no, they were coming out into the streets and they were saying, down with imperialism, down with capitalism. Women all over the world have to engage in struggle. We have to be militant. And I think that shows the character of not just Cuban women in Cuban society, but all Cuban people in Cuban society. And so when we talk about the blockade and we talk about the effects that it has, there is no question that it impacts women first. All aspects of mechanisms of war, and of course blockades are a mechanism of war, impact women first because women are not able then to provide for their families. They're not able to then be able to go about day-to-day life in their work. They're not able to receive essential products. They're not able to receive essential medicine. And of course, the military-industrial complex, which really should be called the military prostitution industrial complex, exports the sex trade everywhere it sets up its military bases. And so when women are impacted first, we have to recognize that women are also going to be the ones who are on the front lines to struggle against the imperialist Yankee attacks. And certainly, as we can see, that is the case in Cuba. Women are active parts of and leaders in the revolution. And so I think something that we need to emphasize on this show especially is that when the blockade comes to an end, because it will come to an end, it is going to be because of the leadership of the masses of Cuban people, and especially the Cuban women and gender oppressed people who are on the front lines. And that is something that we should always remember, is that women hold up half the sky. And certainly that's the case in the Cuban Revolution.
Inshallah. Very beautifully said. And women do hold up half the sky, as Thomas Sankara and Chairman Mao eloquently let us know. And yeah, inshallah, within our lifetime and very soon, imperialism will fall, and the genocidal blockade will come to an end. And I think that that's something that is a motivating factor, right, for us to see the resiliency of Cuban women, of our Cuban comrades, and see how that continues to inspire like movements globally, right, as we continue to resist against Yankee imperialism and then just imperialism as a whole. I think that this is something that our enemy continuously does, tries to like divide like the struggle and make it seem as if it's like isolated events or isolated instances. But as you just said, Comrade Ermiya, this is something that is, unified. This is a struggle that is, global, and it is something that we continue to take inspiration from one another. And we see this resiliency as within in Cuba, in Palestine, in Lebanon, and Iran, wherever it is, right? This is something that continues to motivate us. And as like people who live within the belly of the beast, I think there's a lot that we can learn and a lot of like motivation that we receive from our comrades as well to continue resisting here within the empire. So thank you both so much for your responses and for that clarity, that revolutionary clarity that is very pivotal and needed, especially at this time. So I'm going to pass to you, Ermiya, to get us grounded with our next section, with our next talking point, as we continue to talk about, resistance against like imperialist propaganda, and most recently, where Cuba's democratically elected president Miguel Díaz-Canel did an interview with corporate media for one of the very first, I think, interviews that he's done, and talking a bit about that.
Yes, indeed. And to provide some context before the video starts, this past week, as you mentioned, Comrade Jessenia, President Díaz-Canel was interviewed by NBC News. This is the first time in a long time that he has done press interviews with American press. And the reporter had asked some quite nonsensical questions. So let's take a look at his response.
Would you be willing to step down if it meant saving Cuba? ¿Está dispuesto a dimitir con tal de salvar a Cuba, para la gente de Cuba, al pueblo de Cuba?
Tú que eres una periodista importante, reconocida.
Important and recognized journalist. Have you ever asked that question to any other president in the world?
Because it's one of the conditions the United States is asking for. Would you ever consider that?
Let me explain. Have you asked that question to any other president in the world?
Have
you asked that question to any other president in the world?
Yes.
Could you ask that question to Trump?
Very hard questions of President Trump.
Eso muestra, ¿es una pregunta tuya o es una pregunta del departamento?
Is that a question from you, or is that coming from the State Department of the U.S. government?
My question is, because it's one of the things that we've heard the U.S. government talk about, that they want political change here in Cuba. So my question for you, if they asked you, if they said this is one condition, would you step down?
Because of your honesty, I'm going to assume that you're asking that question because of those reasons. In Cuba, the people who are in leadership position is not elected by the U.S. government, and they don't have a mandate from the U.S. government. We have a free sovereign state, a free state. We have self-determination and independence, and we are not subjected to the designs of the United States. On the other hand, Cuban leaders are not here representing an elite of power. You can see my background, where I was born, my family, what I've done throughout my life. We are elected by the people, although there's a narrative trying to disregard that. Any one of us, before we become part of a leadership role, we need to be elected at the grassroots level in an electoral district by thousands of Cubans. And then those who represent the Cubans at the National Assembly of the People's Power elect those leadership positions and those offices like it happens in many other countries around the world. So we have an election system on the basis of people's participation. So whenever we take this responsibility position and this leadership position, is not out of our personal ambition or a corporate ambition or even a party ambition. We do that as a mandate by the people. And the concept of revolutionaries giving up and stepping down is not part of our vocabulary. If the Cuban people understand that I'm not fit for office, that I am not I have no reason to the occasion, then and I should not be holding this position of president, I will respond to them. But you need to realize that you should not focus only on the president of the country, because we have a collegiate leadership which is very closely linked to the people. But it's not the United States that can impose anything on us. The U.S. government that has implemented that hostile policy against Cuba has no moral to demand anything from Cuba. They have no moral, not even to say that they are concerned about the situation of the Cuban people, and that the Cuban government has taken Cuba to this situation when they have all this responsibility on their shoulders. I think the most important thing would be for them to understand and take this critical position, a sincere position, and that they recognize how much it has cost the Cuban people, what the policy that they have implemented in terms of what they've done, and how much they have deprived the American people from a normal relationship with the Cuban people, and that they set out, as we have requested and as we have asked and as we're interested in, to engage in dialogue and discuss any topic without any condition, not demanding changes from our political system, as we are not demanding changes from the American system, about which we have a number of doubts and a number of considerations, and that we can focus on what brings us together and what can create spaces of understanding in order to move away from confrontation and having a path forward for both countries of benefits of friendship and solidarity.
We thank.
So that was Díaz-Canel speaking with NBC News. Onya, I want to play you in. What do you think of the question that was being asked of him at the beginning? If he'll step down, how much of this rhetoric is coming from the State Department and U.S. war machine?
Man, I watched that whole interview. I'm going to put the link to it in the chat in a second. I thought it was really disrespectful. One, like right before, just off top, like it's an absurd question to ask. And I could see, like, he was like taken aback. He's like, would you ask Trump that? And she's like, I asked Trump hard questions. I'm like, y'all don't ask him enough hard questions. And you certainly wouldn't ask him that, even though we all know the man's a disgrace. Everybody's pretending like everything's normal. Absolutely not. So that, just like asking the question on top, is just like, woo, absurd. And it speaks a lot to like the hubris of the United States and like it's the ruling class media. But like also right before she asked that, like he said, we have to go. Like the Cuban president, for very understandable reasons, does not often give interviews to U.S. media simply because U.S. media is trifling and asking questions like that. It just does not respect the Cuban Revolutionary Project. But he was like, we got to go. We have to go somewhere else. And she like convinces him to stay. He's like, okay, fine, I'll stay for your last few questions. And then she comes out with that. And I'm like, girl, like what's wrong with you? Like, why would you? Like even the framing of the question, like if the U.S. government makes a demand to change the government the Cuban people chose, would you do that? Like, why would you think that you have the right? Why would you think that's okay to ask? Like she didn't even question herself. And the whole interview is full of questions like that. It's so disgraceful. I'm just like, yeah, I have so many feelings about it, but that's what came up for me.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's real. That's real. I think, like you said, he has every right. And for this reason exactly, to not do interviews with US media. We know the US media represents the State Department. It represents the corporations that are trying to take over Cuba. So Jessenia, you spoke about the gendered impacts just previously of the blockade on Cuba. But simultaneously, the revolution itself has advanced the position of women and LGBT people more than anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. So tell us what it would mean for these advancements if there were to be a regime change by the US.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I mean, Comrade Onya just kind of touched a bit upon it with their response. If the Yankee imperialists, right, were to, you know, inshallah, they are never successful in enacting this and accomplishing this. It would be a complete disrespect, right, and a complete regression to all the progression that the Cuban Revolution, the socialist project, has been able to enact and implement into place. And as we see, like historically, any and every U.S.-backed like regime change in Latin America, in attempts in West Asia and in Africa, has been a complete like reversal of whatever like structure their revolutionary leaders have been able to put in place. And there has been a lot of like damage that has been implemented, especially towards women and the LGBT plus community. And we see examples of this with like disappearances that happen, and targeting against activists who uplift the gender oppressed movement, and also uplift the progression for women within society. But it will actually remove safeguards that have been put in place within the society to ensure that women are able to access equal access to political, social, and economic rights that have been a challenge and something that has been consistently discussed, and changes have been implemented within the society, especially in Cuba, as inshallah we'll be able to speak about the family code. This was like a very pivotal change that involved a lot of popular referendums, popular assemblies, but it involved solely like focusing exclusively also on the upliftment of the voices of gender oppressed people and women within the Cuban society. And if the imperialists were to be able to do a regime change, then the safeguards in employment against like discrimination will most likely be removed. Access to abortion, childcare, free healthcare, which is also including like gender affirming care for our trans and queer siblings. Those would be gone, and as we see within the empire, these are constantly rights that are being attacked and being removed, and people are losing access to very pivotal and very vital healthcare that they need. But it also will get rid of the institutional structure of Cuba, because education is accessible and it's free to all. That's something that will be challenged and most likely will be removed, because as we know, the imperialist enemy relies on people being in kind of a state of mind of ignorance and arrogance, so that they can continue to keep us under subjugation. And as Jose Marti has said, to be educated is to be free. People will lose essentially that freedom, and that access and that right to education, to knowledge, to wisdom. And I just want to also share that today is actually the anniversary of Playa Girón, right? And it was a decisive victory against the imperialists, where Cuba was able to successfully, defend the homeland and to defend the socialist revolution. So, as our Cuban comrades have said, as we know, right, as friends, supporters of the Cuban Revolution, and as comrades, if the imperialists try to go into Cuba again, they will face defeat as they faced during Playa Girón, and the imperialists will not be successful, because as we see, the discipline that Iran is giving to them, right, that is the same discipline that our Cuban comrades will give, and inshallah it will be a decisive victory as it was then, and if they attempt now, it will be the same thing. So the revolution and the oppressed shall be victorious, because this is something that is affirmed and clearly expressed to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but this is also something that we know, that we will be victorious, inshallah. So Yeah, the imperialists will die as cowards if they try anything again, and that will actually be the last thing that they see of a continual revolutionary Cuba, and the flag will wave over their faces, essentially.
Yes, indeed. And I want to share a quote that the user in the chat, Sir Exodus 38, just shared, which is one of my favorite quotes from Comandante Fidel. And it reads, "The Yankees may be able to put a man on the moon, but they'll never put a man in Havana." So, Onye, I know you'll get into this in more depth later, but what's the Cuban people's response to this? The US wants to push the idea that this is an organic call for regime change, but the masses of Cubans are saying otherwise, especially as they prepare for MayDay celebrations.
I mean, Díaz-Canel at the end of that question, like he's like, this woman asked me what? And then he like recomposes himself and starts to explain the organization of the Cuban state, which the US government and a lot of people living in the US do not understand. They did it with Fidel. They're doing it with Díaz-Canel, where they assume that this singular figure represents like the Cuban government, like that. It's like this one guy calling the shots, or like the Castro family calling the shots. And if you switch out that one guy, then that leaves Cuba open for whatever the U.S. wants to establish in its place, like basically recolonizing Cuba, like Jessenia just laid out. However, the Cuban Revolution, from its inception, has always been a collective project that organized the masses of people across Cuban society in each sector, whether it's women, whether it's queer and trans people, whether it's Africans, whether it's students, whether it's farm workers, whether all across Cuban society, you have these mass organizations of Cuban people who have organized themselves, come together to build this state, to build this government. And at each level, from like their block to their province, to their city, like at each level, they have elected leadership that is accountable to those mass organizations. Like in the United States, if you get enough money, you can run for anything and win. And the people in your district are like, who is that? Like they can't even reach you. They don't know who you are. That is not the case in Cuba. Those people come from the mass organizations and they answer to the mass organizations, which means they cannot move as individuals. They cannot be ops because the people will come for them. Cuba has, like, they had that literacy campaign where they focused on getting everybody able to read and everybody's able to understand the theory, and got them all to the same level of understanding so they could work together to build this revolutionary project and this state and this government together. They're also all armed. They get military training. So a very educated population that is armed, and you're saying this one guy controls it? No. So even the question of like, will you step down to save Cuba? It wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter. And that's also precisely what happened in Venezuela. Because when you have a revolutionary socialist project, when you have a mass people's party, whether it's the Communist People's Party or Communist Party of Cuba or the PSUV in Venezuela, pushing out one person does nothing because everybody's organized and activated. That is fundamentally why the U.S. has never been able to overthrow the Cuban Revolution, because they think they can try to assassinate Fidel Castro 600 times, and once they get him out, that's going to do it. No, the Cuban people are going to fight to the death because they won their liberation. They don't want you to be colonized by you. They're not being tricked. They built this. This is theirs. So yeah, and then also I didn't answer the I got like so offended with the lady's question that the part of the previous question about where the question came from, like if it's the State Department, like yes. Like when I was watching that interview, at first it was very clear to me that the reporter had lacked like even a basic understanding of how the blockade works. Like she was asking questions like, why isn't Cuba like China, where you have like market economy under socialism? And I'm like, the blockade literally systematically cuts off Cuba's access to the international market. So how could they possibly embrace a market economy like China when the U.S. is intentionally trying to prevent that? Girl, did you not read it? Did you not like look it up? Like, what do you mean? So like you could tell both in her basic lack of understanding about what the blockade looks like. She also kept asking, but there was economic problems in Cuba before the blockade. I was like, under Batista? Who put in Batista? What do you mean, girl? Like, so just you could tell that she didn't do her research, and also that she got talking points for how to talk about it, because there is another point in the interview where he's saying blockade the whole time, and she's saying embargo. And one time she like switches it up and then catches herself really fast. And I could tell it's because someone told her it's an embargo. Don't call it a blockade. Like, don't concede that. So I'm just like,
that's right.
Yeah, there's clearly like you know, the U.S. would not allow, the U.S. government would not allow a reporter in capitalist media to have a sit-down interview with the president of a country that they're trying to, whose government they're trying to overthrow, without giving like something about how the interview is going to go. And I feel like you could see that throughout the interview, and I definitely encourage folks to watch it. So I went on multiple tangents, but that's what I feel. It's a collective revolution. Taking out one guy will do nothing.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. So lesson from this interview and from today's episode, y'all, do not repeat State Department talking points, because these are talking points coming from the State Department. They are not organically produced from the masses of Cubans. So thank you both. Onya, I now turn to you to discuss this organization of Cuban people in more depth.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are in the Centenary of Fidel Castro. It is his 100th birthday this summer on August 13th. The National Network on Cuba and the Vencemos Brigade are going to be organizing to uplift the legacy of Fidel Castro all this year, culminating in the Centenary of Fidel Brigade, which we'll talk about in more detail in a second. But it's really important to understand, again, what we've been like pushing to y'all this entire episode, that Fidel Castro, Miguel Díaz-Canel are like very strong revolutionaries, representatives of the Cuban Revolution, but they are not the sole power of the Cuban Revolution. The organized masses of Cuban people are the power of the Cuban Revolution, and has only succeeded as a project for the past 60 plus years because it is a project of the Cuban people, built collectively and surviving collectively. That is also the reason why, no matter how much the US attempts to destabilize the Cuban Revolutionary Project, to foment destabilization within the project, they have never been able to succeed. Like, we're coming up on the anniversary of the July 11th protests, like started by the so-called San Isidro movement, where people are like, there's going to be mass mobilizations in Cuba. The Cuban people are rising up and they're sick of the blockade and they're sick of how ineffective the government is. But it was like mostly organized on the outside in the Cuban diaspora. And when the day came for like the mass uprisings in Cuba, they had some, but the mobilizations in support of the Cuban Revolution were much, much, much bigger and much more sustained. And even those little manifestations of discontent on July 11th could not produce the long-term destabilization that the United States was hoping for. And again, that is precisely because of the collective organization of the Cuban people. One man cannot defend a nation of 11 million people against constant attempts to destroy it. It is only the collective organization of those people that has enabled the Cuban Revolution to survive up until this point and to continue surviving, just like Jessenia laid out. So I have some questions for y'all. Jessenia, collective organization is the Cuban people's primary weapon against the blockade, in my opinion. Do you agree? And what other forms of resistance complement this collective organization?
Thank you for that question. I totally agree. I think that collectivism is, the unifying force that we need in order to continue to resist against oppression, and as you were saying, like, to ensure like collective survival, but also once the blockade and once imperialism is eradicated from every corner of the world that it finds itself in, especially from the constant oppression that we're forced to endure and live under from the Yankees. This is essentially like what is the force that is motivating the people to continue to resist and to continue to collectively, build and hope for a better future, right? And holding on to mass organization, holding on to collectivism is what allows us to be able to even think that another world is possible, right? Because if we don't hold on to that, then we're just going to be consistently living in, a mirage of illusions in which we just accept reality as like currently as it is, and we won't try to like implement any type of like revolutionary change or bring about, progression within the society, right? And this is something that from like discussions I've had with like Cuban comrades, learning more about socialist Cuba and the revolution as a whole, this is something that has brought about personal change, but I've also seen like this socialist transformation, like the transformation of a new socialist person, right? As Fidel and Che advocated for, that's something that has been, brought about, right? And it's something that we see with our Cuban comrades, and then it's also something that we see as the resistance movement globally as a whole. And I think what other forms of resistance complement this? I think, personally speaking, holding on to the principles of Islam is something that brings about, forms of resistance, because there's like a stigma or a way of life that the imperialists force us to be like. And this is something that Comrade Ermiya mentioned, the exportation of, the sex trade of like prostitution, essentially, right? It's upholding modesty, upholding humility, and also affirming that, respecting our siblings, right, as we wish to be respected, is something that is a form of resistance, because the imperialists constantly want us to, be disrespectful to one another, to not hold consideration or compassion for each other, and to essentially hold on to a form of character that just continues to bring about degradation and forces us to, we call it into a state of like fitna, which is like to live in a mirage, like temptation, to live in a mirage of like immoral behavior, immoral character. So upholding like these pillars of humility, of modesty, of compassion is a form of resistance, and it is to resist against like the social deprecation that the imperialist society thrives on. Because if we're consistently forced to, like degrade ourselves, to live like in a hypersexualized world, then we're only going to be thinking about that, right? We're not going to be thinking about, the books that we can read, the sites that we can see, things that we can learn from one another. We won't respect like the integrity of our minds, and our hearts. Will only be focusing solely on like what gratification can we get from like any sort of like pleasure. So I think that that's like a very pivotal form of resistance that I think needs to come about within the transformation of like society here, within the empire, and it's something that we consistently see like being challenged, right, by other nations who are forced to endure militarization and all of like the injustices that come with it, right? That another form of resistance is also honoring the resistance of our ancestors, right? As our Cubans know, and have said it multiple times, like the socialist revolution, it didn't start in 1959, right? It was like a part of the ongoing revolution, but it actually began from the very first moment that the Spaniards, that the Yankees landed on our shores, right? And it began with the resistance of our indigenous ancestors. It began with the resistance of our African ancestors, who were forced to leave their homes and were forced over to other lands, and build communities with each other, and they resisted in different forms of way, either through like artistic expression, as we see like in Cuba through rumba, in Puerto Rico with bomba y plena, and Haiti with gaga, right, with huerara, with other forms of like resistance, artistic expressions. That's another form for us to be able to resist. So it's the unification of the rhythm of the drum, and through the expression of dance, which is something that I have to find reconciliation between with like upholding the pillars of Islam, but also honoring the way that ancestors have been successful in resisting and launching revolutions in a language that the enemy didn't understand, right? Because everything had to be done in secret, and it had to be done in a way that uplifted community while not putting it at risk. So I think that those are two other forms of resistance, and also political education. So like discussions like this, it's very pivotal. It brings about continual increasement of revolutionary consciousness, but it also provides information that the imperialists, the ruling class media, consistently hides from the masses. It manipulates the messaging, right? It manipulates the information, and us doing our due diligence and educating the masses, but also being students of the revolution, is another form of resistance. So it's those three. I said two, but it's those three.
Love that answer. And yeah, I agree. I also think that you can see some of the tactics of resistance that you named and the way that Díaz-Canel approached this interview, understanding the necessity of speaking directly to the US people while refusing to be baited by the frankly disrespectful imperialist framing about like the interview as a whole and the questions that he was being asked. Like just stayed focused and steadfast and like explain the organization of the Cuban state, Cuba's position, why Cuba's system of government and principles are not on the table in any U.S. negotiation, like why that shouldn't be asked, why the idea that the U.S. government is imposing this blockade is like blocking off Cuba's access to oil, is talking about military intervention, like the US government and the State Department are framing that as like interventions to support the Cuban people. And he was like, who the hell are y'all to tell us what's going to support the Cuban people when you have child abusers and pedophiles and sex pests at every level of government, when you have armed and funded a genocide in Palestine and now in Lebanon, and you have the same intent for that entire region of West Asia, when your entire empire is built on a foundation of committing genocide against indigenous peoples across Turtle Island and enslaving African peoples in that same landmass. Like y'all have like this whole long history of degradation and exploitation, and you can see it in your culture. And meanwhile, Cuban culture is again focused on, just like Jessenia laid out, collectivism, political education, embracing the progressive aspects of their culture, rooting themselves in values that are in direct opposition to the individualism and destruction of capitalism and imperialism. So like you really see like the roots, like the tactics that Jessenia laid out that represent how Cuba is able to successfully resist US imperialism. You also see repeated in struggle after struggle. You see the same thing in Iran. The US makes the same mistakes about assessing Iran. They thought if they took out the Ayatollah, that would be the end. They thought then it was Khomeini again. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like they don't understand the roots of resistance to exploitation because their entire culture is built on domination. And so when people do something else, they're like, what are they doing? Is it a trick? They just don't get it. They just don't get it. So I have a question for you, Ermiya. Can collective organization be exported, or Ermiya, I'm so sorry. Can a collective organization be exported or replicated in other struggles?
I mean, absolutely. I think we have to initially recognize that, America has a huge problem with individualism. Americans love their libertarianism. They love their me. They love their, I can do this all by myself. But we have to understand that all people that have defeated their enemy, from Cuba to Vietnam to Iran, have done so through collective struggle, collective organization. And if we do not have that collective organization, then we cannot do anything. We cannot become victorious in any single way. Our girl, Chairman Mao, of course, has a lot of critiques against liberalism. But one of my favorites is he mentioned the fact that we need to not overstate our importance as an individual in struggle. And so we have to move beyond our egotistical ideas and our emphasis on ourselves. And we have to understand that committing yourself to a political struggle is the most important thing that you can do as an individual, right? Being able to commit yourself to your people, put yourself on the line for our liberation, put your life, sacrifice a lot of your comforts in order to create the advancements of everyone around you. I think we as Americans, especially in the imperial core, have to get comfortable with this idea. And so what I think a lot of the lessons we can learn from Cuba, yes, their advancements are amazing. Their system for their people is incredible because it puts people first, not capitalism first. But I think one thing we really need to learn from them is how they moved collectively as one united fist, as an entire society. And I think if we take any lessons back from Cuba here to our movements in America, that is what we have to learn from them, is how to move collectively, how to move in a united way, and to not be so focused on our own individual bickering and obsession with the self.
Love that. And I think that's a really incredible segue to start talking about the brigades, because they are really like the National Network on Cuba, the Venceremos Brigade, Pastors for Peace, the Hands Off Cuba Committee. There's all these organizations within the U.S. Cuba Solidarity Movement, which are focused on taking people from the U.S. to Cuba because it's important for movements for justice in the United States to learn from the example of the Cuban Revolution so we can liberate ourselves and build what the Cubans already have: free healthcare, free education, guaranteed housing, control, like actual democracy. Like that's what the Cuban people have achieved that we are still fighting for here. We're still fighting to not be kidnapped and put in concentration camps or be murdered in the street by police or have our gender identities recognized on our ID. Like basic things that we are still fighting for, Cuba already has because of the collective organization of the Cuban people. And so the brigades are an opportunity for those of us who have been indoctrinated into the individualistic and capitalist culture of the US to learn how to move as a collective, to travel to Cuba in a good way and provide material and political solidarity to the Cuban Revolutionary Project as we also learn from it so we can do the same thing here. And so one of the opportunities that are coming up is also an opportunity to celebrate the legacy of Fidel Castro, not as an individual, but as a product of the Cuban Revolutionary Project. Like he was dope, he was a hero, and he was absolutely 100% the product of collective organization through the Cuban Revolution. He could not have been produced without the Cuban Revolution struggle, Cuban liberation struggle, and that's true for Raul. That's also true for Díaz-Canel. It's true for Belén Espan. It's true for Che Guevara. Like sometimes we think about these individual revolutionary figures as like superheroes, as like singular figures that are just exceptional, and it's very important to understand they're not. That's just the kind of person you turn into when you commit your life to revolution. That's why you should join the organization. That's why you should commit to the struggle. So the application for the Centenary Fidel Brigade, which is a joint project of the National Network on Cuba and the Vencenanos Brigade, closed this past Wednesday at midnight. And in that time, in like 30 days, we got over 200 applications from 30 different US states and also 2 other countries, France and Finland. We saw that, we were like, what? Cool. I don't know if you could come, but we're glad that you're excited as well. So anyway, so we have over 200 applications. Our goal is to bring 150 brigadistas. And also the way that we bring brigades from the US to Cuba, like you cannot just bring 150 people from the US to an anti-imperialist or socialist country with like no training. It's not going to go. It's not going to go well because we are indoctrinated into reactionary beliefs about countries outside the US, period, but certainly about socialist anti-imperialist countries. We're also socialized in some very anti-human and individualistic ways, like certainly like patriarchy, racism, transphobia, queer antagonism, but also like conflict avoidance. You know what I'm saying? Just like a lot of like practices that we are taught that create like very dysfunctional group settings that we do not want to subject our Cuban comrades to. And so both the MayDay Brigade and every brigade the Vencenanos Brigade brings, including the Centenary Fidel Brigade, go through an extended process of brigadista prep, political education systems to give people the same baseline understanding of how the Cuban Revolution works, how it was built, also community agreements, transformative justice processes for giving and receiving feedback, how to navigate conflict, because we understand that we are trying to build a new world and we have to put that into practice first within the context of these brigades in order to do that when we get back to the United States in our movements. So the brigade is departing August 1st. We will be in Cuba August 1st to 15th, including on Fidel's birthday on August 13th. We are now moving from recruiting brigadistas to confirming who will be on that brigade, who's in that 150 with our interview process, because you don't want to bring assholes to Cuba. Let me tell you. So we interview every single person that applies to make sure that we are bringing the best folks at this time. And then once we finish that process, we're going to be fundraising both to provide partial scholarships for folks to travel on the brigade. Like international travel has for a very long time been a privilege for middle-class European people, and like no shade to middle-class European people, but we need the people that represent the front lines of social justice struggles, like poor and working class people, colonized people, women, queer and trans people, to be the folks on these brigades. And those folks need scholarships to be able to participate in international travel. And so we are fundraising for that. And we are also fundraising to bring material aid from the US to Cuba, supplies that they are not able to obtain because of the U.S. blockade on the island. And so we encourage y'all, it's up on the screen right now. If you have spare funds, if you want to support this work, if you want to help us move as a collective from afar, make a donation to support the work of the organizers of the Centenary of Fidel Brigade. So I'm going to drop the link in the chat. And while I'm doing that, do y'all have anything to add? Jessenia or Ermiya?
No, I think that, I'm very excited about this. I think Centennial of Fidel is going to be a big one. And so I think comrades who are going on this brigade are going to learn a lot about his legacy and just how much it's been injected into the Cuban Revolutionary Project and all aspects of Cuban society. So I'm very excited for you, comrades, and cannot wait to hear from all the report backs.
Oh, you're muted, Jessenia. I don't think you're muted, but I still can't hear you. Is it me?
No, I can't hear you either, Jessenia. Sorry, technical difficulties.
No.
It's okay.
Oh, wait. Now we can hear you.
Okay, mashallah. I'm sorry. I've had my laptop for like 4 years, and I think it's on its last leg. But no, yeah, I was just gonna echo what comrades said. If you're able to go on this brigade, it is a very beautiful learning experience to be able to, continuously raise awareness, but also strengthen your consciousness and revolutionary resolve. Is something that is always done right in such a short amount of time during these brigades, and just being in community with like-minded comrades, and stripping away that egoism and that individualism that we are forced to have while living in the empire is something that is consistently challenged when you are in Cuba. So it's something that will strengthen your character, and if conflict comes up, right, is always rooted in a place of love and care and wanting to bring about the betterment of the individual, but also within the collective. So it's never done in ill. It's always with advancing and furthering the revolution, and that comes with changing ourselves, right? Because before we change the world, we have to change ourselves. As our Mama Sada said, right, and as Biggie Smalls also said. But this is something that is at the forefront as a principle with the brigade. So if you have applied and are accepted, please find ways to go. And this is something that is very rooted in us. Living here in the empire is not asking for help, but if you do need help, right, with raising funds, with being able to pay for things, ask your comrades. Think of ideas in order to to be able to fundraise, because this is a very pivotal time. And as many people with the best intentions, with revolutionary resolve, that would love to go to Cuba, our comrades will appreciate and have actually asked for as many of us to be able to go to continue advancing and strengthening the resistance and also the revolution. So Comrade Onye linked the donation link to make a donation for scholarships and material aid. So if you have funds, if we call it chelito, if you have extra money, please donate. Please put your money where your mouth is and help us go. So yes.
Thanks, Comrade. And the last thing I'll say about the Centenary Fidel Brigade before we move to the closing is just that it's also, like I said, it's about the understanding the collective project of the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban government. It's about understanding Fidel as a product of Cuban revolutionary struggle, of collective struggle. But it's also about if you want to go and share criticisms and complaints about Fidel Castro, there are a variety of spaces where you can go. You can lie on him. You can say that he was racist. You can say that he was a homophobe. You can say anything you want about Fidel Castro, baby. I was watching Seinfeld on Netflix, just rewatching it It's still funny. But there was like an episode where they were talking about, I think it was like the Soup Nazi episode, where they were talking about like how controlling it was in the line. And they just like threw a random shot at Fidel Castro and then moved on. And there's so many pieces of US media like that where like Fidel Castro, Che, and the Cuban Revolution as a project just get random shots about dictatorships, about being failures. And that's, again, the part of the project of indoctrination of those of us living in the United States to turn us away from the Cuban Revolution and other struggles against imperialism, other struggles for liberation. And so I say all that to say, on this brigade, we are upholding the legacy of Fidel Castro. We are honoring his contribution to the collective struggle for justice of humanity and life on this planet. There's like going to be a room for many like political perspectives. Like you don't have to be a communist. You can be like a straight up Democrat. You can even be a Republican. We have a couple. That's fine as long as you agree to unite with the BB's points of unity and you are open to learning the truth about Fidel Castro. This is a pro Fidel brigade, unapologetically, because like I said, if you want to attack Fidel Castro, there are so many places you can do that. But we have a responsibility to honor the contribution that the Cuban Revolution made to the global struggle for the liberation of humanity and life on this planet. And that man made his contribution without question. Mm-hmm. Stay mad. Stay mad. Anyway, I'm going to pass it to the comrade.
That's right. And no investigation, no opinion.
No right to speak.
So before we conclude our show, some updates from the National Network on Cuba. The Caravans for Cuba has been traveling state to state, collecting aid, and local organizers of the Action for Cuba committees are now working to move the aid down to Florida, which will be loaded on a charter plane since there was so much aid that was collected, and we'll be taking that aid down to Cuba as a part of the MayDay Brigade at the end of this month. Yes, the 19th annual MayDay Brigade is indeed set to still happen at the end of this month. Brigadistas representing all aspects of movement work, from labor organizations to immigrant rights groups, and many more will be heading to Cuba to join the MayDay festivities and build solidarity with the island through direct engagement with the Cuban people. And it's not just activists from the US, but delegations from all over the world that are going to be joining as well, traveling to Cuba at the end of this month. So what many in the US may not know is that Cuba's MayDay celebrations commemorating International Workers' Day are massive and have all aspects of Cuban society engaged, from unions to preschools. Last year's demonstrations had over 500,000 participants. And this MayDay, Cuba is calling for a continued collectivism from all revolutionary and progressive people of the world to defend Cuban sovereignty. In addition to the MayDay Brigade, the network will be hosting another Bylaws meeting on April 26th to discuss the draft of the new bylaws after continuous dialogue that's been happening for a couple of months now. And the network's annual spring meeting, which is happening on May 30th, is where these bylaws will be finalized. So please put it on your calendars. We hope to see everyone there and fully engaged. And that concludes our show for today. Join us next week, April 24th at the same time for episode 6. Until victory, comrades.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Preocupado el presidente anaranjado, viendo que las elecciones las perdió.
Solicita a los que le hacen los mandados que se apuren pues la fiesta terminó.
Y mirando que se va a acabar el varo,
han formado un titingo. Se han negado a abandonar la Casa Blanca, a la silla del despacho se amarró.
Los pelitos que le quedan los arranca, pataleando por la rabia que le dio.
Y mirando a Cuba con sus batas blancas, de cabeza se tiró.
El que que tenga confusión que se confunda, el que quiera claridad que venga a ver.
La jugada no es compleja ni profunda, está claro cómo quieren proceder.
Solo falta que nosotros los dejemos
y eso no va a suceder.
Con la conga de los hoyos no te metas.
Cuba viva sin que nadie la someta. Mi tierra linda, mi cubanía, mi bandera se respeta. De La Habana para Santiago, defiende lo tuyo, cubano.
Que no te metas con mi tierra, que mi Cuba se respeta.
Soy el mambí que aún vive con el machete en la mano. No, 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 no. ¿Qué me importa si comentas?
De donde vengo yo, estamos listos para la contienda. Aguanta ahí, pero dime tú, ¿pa' qué tú inventas? Con mi pueblo guarachando, yo vine aquí para cantar. Toda Cuba está esperando que yo la ponga a gozar.
Aquí nadie tiene miedo, tú conmigo no te metas. Hey. Oye, soquetón, mi alegría te molesta.